I'm Louis Moroni, and this is Constraints the Podcast from Hi-Fi Handiwork, a 20-episode series. Each episode is a chat with a guest from a creative industry about a project obstacle they've experienced, viewed through the lens of project management's three constraints of scope, time, and budget. Further insights and commentary can be found in the show notes. We hope you enjoy the program. The creative industries are as old as industry itself. No matter what product we talk about, there was always its invention. And that creation of the first of any of its kind is arguably a creative industry. And just as industry has evolved through the generations, from the invention of tools and textiles to agriculture, cars, and space travel, so too have new creative industries emerged. Take gaming, for example. No time need be wasted arguing that gaming is a creative industry, not only for its storytelling, artistry, and world-making, but also the software development that provides its backbone. And along with gaming's evolution, so evolved the art of project management. Traditionally applied in industries like the military and engineering, project management always followed a plan the work, work the plan methodology. That is, until traditional project management proved ineffective in the software development industry, and the formal introduction of Agile project management emerged with the online publication of the Agile Manifesto in 2001. This, I think, places the gaming industry in a unique nexus of project management methodologies, where a balance must be struck between the software development that is always taking place in the background and the production of worlds from conception to completion. Well, our guest this episode will shed some light on this issue. Another TMU alumni and past guest speaker in my class. In her relatively short career, Jenn Doan has helped produce games for two of the biggest names in the industry, and with her project management professional designation from the Project Management Institute, she has a keen understanding of how the gaming industry gets things done. I'm keen to see if we follow a traditional or agile approach to today's discussion. So, Jenn Doan, welcome to Constraints.
Thanks for having me, Louis.
Whew. The people won't know, but I took a lot of takes on that one. I don't usually. I must be nervous. Okay, so here we go. We're going to jump right in. You have a project we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so I can't talk about anything currently, but I do have one in mind, which is a few years back when I was at Ubisoft and we were working on Far Cry 6. As we were wrapping up that production, what we call closing a project, I had moved over to start a new skeleton team to begin a licensed mission or licensed content with Netflix's Stranger Things. So effectively, it was a mini project at the end of a bigger project where we had to build a new world within about 8 months to ramp up and close everything in 8 months. And yeah, I think that would be a great one to chat about today.
Okay, and you said a lot there, and I'm going to try to remember, first of all, closing. What does that mean? What does that mean in your world?
Yeah. And the game development framework is something that's very specific, but applies to a lot of different projects. Closing is usually the last phase when you release the base game title. So in traditional senses of games where you have physical releases with CDs, this would be finalizing software, getting things to shelves, and that requires closing a lot of the what's in the build, closing out last bugs, last feedback, and then after that there's a lot of verification and submission processes with people like Sony and Microsoft for PlayStation and Xbox to review that and then rate the game. So that whole process vaguely gets referred to as closing.
And that was a closure of Far Cry.
Yeah, Far Cry 6.
And I know we're not going to talk about that, but just to back up, because I do know from you being in my class that your project team had a very specific role in Far Cry. It's not like you were the Far Cry team. The Far Cry team is a Far Cry distance away from one group. So can you just sort of summarize sort of what your project within the larger project was for that? And then we will move on.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And good pun there.
Thank you.
Yeah, so for the Far Cry 6 team, because each year the whole team gets rebuilt, sometimes different studios take on different, the lead on different projects. So for Far Cry 6, the team I had the privilege to work on was the world team. And even within the world team, that gets segmented by map. So specifically on my side, I was handling a lot of the project coordination for about like a third, 2/3 of the world map for Far Cry 6. And that consists of job roles and disciplines like environment art and level design or mission design, open world design, essentially. A lot of the actual physical world building goes into this too. So the planning of layouts and what they look like. You don't really think about it, but when you play a game, a lot of the background and environments and the actual, not the assets, but like the things that drive what's in the assets. So like placing them and scripting the missions and what goes where, if there's a house here. That's usually a dedicated team that's just focused on that the entirety of production.
So your team was building this world, basically, and can I call it basically this like a static world where the players would actually interact within? So you're building that world.
Yeah, although it is dynamic because there's also NPCs and encounters and things that change, and lighting affects things too. So there's different settings. An open world inherently is actually the opposite of static, but
okay,
continue.
I see. Yeah. And by the way, I know what NPC means, but maybe you could explain that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Non-playable character.
Okay,
yeah.
Beautiful. So the people that are sort of running around and that you're interacting with potentially, but they're not playing the game.
Yeah, they're not player avatars, but they're the pieces that add life to the world. So I kind of like to call it living world or dynamic features. Essentially things that move and make the world feel alive. It's pretty much all an illusion, but all of these are stacks of features on top of each other, many of which have dedicated teams and sometimes dedicated project managers or producers overseeing the development of them.
So your team was responsible for 1/3 of the map of the overall Far Cry world.
Yes.
And there were other teams responsible for the rest of the world, and then there were teams responsible for the actual play interface, I'll call it.
Yeah. Like there was a dedicated team that's just on the assets, which is the actual objects that go into our world. And then there were teams, so we had a biomes team that's just grass and trees and foliage. With AAA games, Ubisoft's a good example of them. You're dealing with such a huge scale that a lot of the teams get broken down to be quite specialized. Not because for anything except just like there's so much work to break down already. And within them, they're usually quite independent to make their own decisions and timelines and roadmaps and whatnot.
And AAA is?
AAA would be a designation. I hope I get this definition right. It's like a designation of what would be a high-budget, large-scale game are usually called AAA. So you have indie games, which are independent. It has nothing to do with the actual gameplay, but just the scale of how much money typically goes into it and the marketing budget. So AAA would be the equivalent of like Hollywood blockbuster films. You have AAA games.
And how many people on that team dedicated to that 1/3 of the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to remember just the artists and not asset artists, but like the environment artists. I think we had about 10 to 20 for just 1/3 of the map on rotation, covering all of the virtual square meters of that map. And those also included like kind of additional people like AI programmers and encounters and designers. Once you factor them in, it starts to grow to more like 30 to 50 plus. Right. But the whole world team, I do recall being kind of like around like a few dozen at least. Yeah.
Okay. So you moved from there to what you called a mini project.
Yes.
Okay.
So with that, as we were closing, because usually when you're in development, when the game comes out as a player, you would play the base game, and then within a year, within a few months, or years, depending on the life cycle of it, there would be new content. So to get ahead of it, the development team actually works ahead. So as we were closing, my team was pretty much done. We're kind of hands off the build. I started moving over to a smaller initiative, which we called post-launch. And that's where we were doing some of the licensed content with Netflix and some other collaborators as well. And then that team is more of a skeleton crew. So where I talked about a few dozen, my team suddenly became about like 3 to 5 artists. And we obviously had more people, but like it was definitely a smaller scale, more leaner, more agile kind of setup there.
When you say more agile, do you mean you actually employed a more agile project management approach, or because you were so small, you were just agile?
Both, actually, yeah. So we were always kind of hybrid. Like I think overall the methodology never changed, but with a smaller team, we could actually add new processes that were more true to the agile philosophy of like how we go through certain ceremonies. Like our stand-ups became actual stand-ups, and our sprint retros and whatnot could be a little more effective. It's a lot easier said than done when the team's smaller because there's a bit more openness to be able to change things. You have a lot less buy-in. The team gelled together already too. Like by that point, we've all worked together at a minimum of 2-3 years together already. Mm-hmm. So starting this mini project, we can kind of already come in with improvements that we were wanting to have from the main game ready to go. So all of those learnings were kind of already anticipated and wanted.
Right. Okay. So you, and now I am backing up a little bit again. So you had your larger team, 1/3 world. How similarly did you and your team work in terms of processes with the other teams that were working on their own worlds? Was there sort of like an overriding Ubisoft?
I say Ubisoft, but okay. I've heard both. I don't know which one's the right one.
I have a little deja vu. I think we've had this conversation.
I know.
Before.
I think so too. Yeah.
So how much of your project processes are determined at that phase of the project by Ubisoft or Ubisoft's way of managing projects? And then how much flexibility did you have once you got to that mini project to do things the way you wanted?
Yeah, that's a good question. The overall framework, so we just talked about closing at the end there, which is part of the framework, but the overall steps of what a project has to go through is one that doesn't really change. It's just something that's standard, even industry-wide, of everything has a strict pre-production, production, closing phase. But then within that, it's really up to the discretion of the team. So with the Far Cry 6 post-launch team, I was really thankful that the lead producer there was very open and trusting and quite giving in a way to let teams work the way they needed to or wanted to work. And there was a very high trust environment there. So it was a lot easier to propose changes. Obviously, things still had to go through a process of, making sure, everything's kind of T's are crossed, I's are dotted. But so there was a lot of appetite for us to update certain things, even as simple as Jira pipeline workflows, things that we found really painful and heavy in the past. We got to adopt something way more streamlined. And we were almost like a guinea pig project where myself and another project manager I worked with, we were mad scientists trying to see, oh my gosh, we could finally change this. And we had the chance to try it. And it was honestly really successful. It wasn't easy the entire way, but the buy-in and the willingness to try was a lot easier. You didn't have to go to 50 teams and ask for permission. We almost could just go with it because we were the team.
Right. Okay. So what happened?
Yeah. So, with the project itself, it was a really interesting setup because with Netflix's Stranger Things project, one, it was super cool. I was a huge fan of Stranger Things. It was a dream come true to work on this. And so did a lot of people on the team. They felt really passionate about this idea. But what was interesting was we had to build a world that still connected to the main game world. So there's kind of two worlds we're talking about here. And between the two, we couldn't change anything in the main game because the main game is an unmoving kind of entity. It is already going to ship. So we had to work around it to add in our layer of content and then work out of it to create our additional locations and things. So it's a bit complicated to explain without context. So I'll try to simplify, but please stop me if it's if I need to explain anything. But essentially, we needed to find a lot of areas to reuse and scout for locations in our existing world.
Scout, go virtually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just like real life, where you have to scout locations for a movie. We had to scout in our own game locations we had already built to be a good foundation for cinematics and where our licensed mission was going to take place, because we still had to use what we had to introduce the mission and whatnot. We were still building a new world, but it had to connect somewhere. So we were scouting for cave entrances and towns, and there were already proposals of what would work. And just like a real location scouting, we're looking at what has the best views, what has the least travel time, and what does the flow feel like, because like world development and planning cinematics and all that stuff, it's just like real life. Like you can't change mountains in real life.
Right.
And in the game, you can't change mountains either. You kind of have to work with what you have.
Okay, so now, you just... Here's what now, this is... I'm sorry, let me back up. Or let me try it. Let me get at this again. You just built 1/3 of this world. Are you... What areas are you talking about that you're looking at that you aren't familiar already with? Or how does that work?
Yeah, so, I mean, I could work backwards here. So basically, like, with the post-launch game with Stranger Things, the directors and the creative director, etc., they already had a vision of what they wanted to see. So basically, by the time we had started the project, there was a very loose skeleton of the story beats of the story they wanted to tell, which is, I assume there's going to be no spoilers for whoever's not played the game in the last few years. Basically, it's the idea that your dog in-game gets lost and is taken by the I don't know the name that's not in Spanish because that's how we wrote it. It's the El Devorador, which is like the one of the main villains in one of the previous seasons. So he gets taken through a cave, and there's this whole story of like you end up in a bunker, and then you end up in the upside down world, and then there's this huge like mind flayer and all these things. So they kind of pitched this idea, which kind of marked a few things. It's like the upside down is a brand new world. We have nothing like that. We have to build that from scratch. And then there's a bunker. We have lots of bunkers in the game. So we needed to find a real bunker that we had already made during the game development cycle to then reuse for the purpose of this licensed mission. And then there were a bunch of story beats in the beginning to intro it. So like we needed an abandoned town and a cave entrance that takes you to the bunker, all these things. So all those we had to find as separate locations. So I did know a lot of these locations already, which is probably why I was the one to segue into the Stranger Things project. Mm-hmm. We were kind of drawing from a lot of the areas we had built already, but it was just more like showing these locations to the cinematic director and the art director and whatnot who don't know the location very well.
Right. And showing that they can work.
Yes.
Which you're not even necessarily sure they will work because you haven't looked at them from the perspective of trying to integrate it into this Stranger Things world. Yeah,
and no one's known this yet. So at the time, we just knew the vague details. Even back then, we were wondering, there were a huge slew of ideas we were rifling through of like, what could this new world look like? We were thinking of like super cheap, like liminal space options where it's just a black world, nothing else. But, early on, there was already an interest in this like very alluring idea of like, what if we just made a new world from scratch, copying something from the actual game, and then we added a layer to make it feel like the Upside Down. So it was kind of a medium. It was very cheap to make because we didn't have to build everything from scratch, and it would have a really huge impact story and narrative wise that you're kind of in this world that was familiar and now suddenly feels very unfamiliar. So all of these locations were kind of scouted, and then we eventually found the places we were happy with. And then we set the team to work to start scripting their add-ons. So we had a designer who scripted the entire mission. So this is the actual, like, what happens when you get there and all the logic to string these locations together. And then we had the art team, which is where I was more closely aligned, the world art team. And then we were actually dressing these locations and creating the bunkers and the upside-down bunker and all these areas to deliver on all these story beats. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know.
It's making sense to me. And I'm sorry to sort of go slowly through it, but this is, I mean, I'm actually not close to this world at all, and I'm sure some people listening are saying, oh, just let her get on with the story. Stop asking questions.
No, it's good to know because your questions would be replicated by anyone listening. So I'm glad you're asking.
Okay, so we have the mini project. We kind of know what we're doing here. You have 3 to 5 people on your team that are tasked with realizing this vision of the Stranger Things extension to the Far Cry world. Is that a good description?
Yeah. It's like a limited time content that we were basically going to do. Like it was a free, like DLCs you usually pay for, but this was a free kind of content add-on about a year in.
And the idea is it promotes Stranger Things, and for Far Cry fans, and for Stranger Things fans, it promotes Far Cry. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, like it's just like more brand awareness, I assume. Yeah. I don't know the motivations on why Netflix decided to go for the Far Cry 6 collaboration. I know, at least when I first heard about it, I thought it was so new and different. It's not something you expect, but I love that they did that. But yeah, it's a way for the game to feel fresh and kind of give additional incentives to make sure people are still playing the game, or if people were on the fence about playing, suddenly you attract a new segment of audiences that are maybe like, oh my gosh, this is so cool, I want to play it. I'll buy the game to try this mission, and I don't know, maybe I'll stick around and keep playing.
Right. Okay. So how did that go?
Yeah, I mean, one, it went great. It was super fun. Like the team was really close-knit. And one thing that we really felt was a success, and it took a little bit of time because our team wasn't exactly the team we worked with on the main game. For example, our directors and leads were not the directors and leads we worked with on the main game. So it was kind of a different process of getting to know people's leadership styles and, you know, what they know or don't know about world production. It's very specific. But what we felt was a really huge success, one, was that the team had a lot more agency to drive their own work. And what I mean by that is on a larger game, just due to logistical complexity, everything kind of gets broken down and specialized. So your role might just be all the way up until a certain point, and then it gets handed off to someone else. And then they work up to a certain point, and then they hand it off. And then what it kind of creates is this idea of like the overall work kind of being segmented, maybe sometimes too much, that no one sees the big picture of why you did that thing, or what that blue door is for, or like what is this mission even. Like it's very common to be working on something and have no idea how people are going to be using it and needing more information. But with our smaller project and smaller team, we had the luxury to kind of involve people from the beginning and include them to create their own requests and their own ideas and pitch them, and they're involved end to end. So what that allowed for was kind of a lot more meaningful work and input almost to come from the team. And it just, people felt a lot more satisfied to be able to see kind of the results of their own agency too, of like things happening in the world, and you don't have to talk to like 50 people to get a single thing done. You could just do it yourself or chat with one person and it's done.
Right. So can I call it Big Far Cry? What do we call just the main game? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Big Far Cry.
In the main game,
yeah.
You have all these people that are segmented, and they're doing small pieces in part of the process, and then in your mini project or in your Stranger Things, what did you call it? Doesn't matter. Stranger Things expansion?
Yeah, the post-launch. Yeah.
Post-launch. They actually are executing more skills than in the main game. They're doing more than they would have in the process.
Yeah, or it'd be the same skills, but there would be more context. I don't know if that makes more sense. Yeah.
All right. So, how did those people get chosen? Was it their a faith in their creativity, or was it their skill? What was it that made them, was it a coveted role to be part of this mini project, or?
That I was a lot less involved in, because by the time I had joined, first of all, like I was not very high up on the totem pole, so it's just more if people told me where I was going, and it's like, okay, I'm going there, that's cool.
Right.
So it was usually predetermined by the leadership team, just for various reasons, who's available, who has interests in certain things. There's also multiple projects going on at the same time at the studio, so it's not like Far Cry 6 was the only project we had going on. And then skill sets were another thing as well. So the different missions had different contexts where some people already were better suited for the project idea. So, for example, a lot of our locations very early on was decided that we would use the west area of the map to be the locale for this mission. And then being the production coordinator on the west side of the map, that made a lot more sense. I already knew the locations, I knew the artists, so that was kind of the logic, I would imagine. But I think it's not really anything more dramatic than that. I think it's just business as usual on who goes where. Yeah.
So on the business as usual, So the people that work in the gaming industry, there's a lot of moving around. Is there moving around between projects and moving around between companies? Is there a lot of sort of free flowing of talent? How does that? And is there a lot of security for people that work in the gaming industry that, hey, when this project ends, I'll be able to pick up another one?
Totally, yeah. It's a good question and a very topical one. I feel like if you asked this like a few years ago before COVID and asking this now, the answers differ very wildly. Like I think back then there was a lot more job security and a lot more agency, more on the employee side to be able to choose and have more of a say in where they're going, where they're staying, that kind of stuff. The industry was also in a very different place. But now I think there's a lot of moving of talent. I think it's very common after a project is done that people look elsewhere or look elsewhere within a company. It doesn't have to be changing companies. But now we also have a huge trend, unfortunately, on the number of layoffs we also have in the games industry for various reasons. Projects get canceled, studios have to size down, they might not have funding, or just even like it's a quarterly kind of business strategy move to cut certain divisions, and those results in huge layoffs as well. So there's definitely been a huge trend of layoffs, but I think per studio, per project, it really varies. So overall, I think now it is a pretty like dynamic, I'd say, like a lot of people leaving, a lot of people coming, which is kind of unfortunate. I think a lot of times it's not voluntary. But on the other side, I think for people who might be specialized, like very specific roles that aren't quite as common, those are always kind of in demand. And I would say that's a very lucky position to be in, is like one where you still have a lot of say in where you want to go. And that's maybe where you could be a bit more picky or choosy on what projects speak to you and what kind of fits your values as a thing to work on. Because keep in mind, these projects are like about at least 1 year usually, but it's very common for them to go from 3 to 5 years even, or longer in development.
Is it common for them to start by thinking it's only going to be 3 years and then it ends up being 5 years?
I'd say so, yeah. At least for AAA productions. If it's already taking 3 years, sometimes by the time you're at like the second year, the writing's on the wall of like, oh God, like there's no way we're going to close this within a year. There's so much that already has to go in just to handle the process, let alone the ideation. But overall, like it's at least in the case of Far Cry 6, that was a project that took a lot longer than I think anyone had anticipated. So some people were on it for quite a long time. Yeah.
What was the? I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into this, and then I won't take up too much more of your time. But and I know we were talking about. The Stranger Things, but just in terms of the additional length that Far Cry took, I guess what was the pressure to not take longer, and B, what were the implications of it taking longer?
Yeah, to be honest, maybe just to reframe your question, because I feel like I wasn't as involved with the main game on some of the decisions there, but I could speak more back to like the post-launch, which was just the mini version of this. The timeline for that one was very rigid, like because the game was already live and we have a very, once the post-launch is in order, it's a public calendar. People already know what month things are going to be coming out. So when we had 8 months to do this project, it really was just 8 months. Like there wasn't really a possibility of extension. And as well, because we had a licensed partner, the time and validity of when we would have certain assets and the right to use assets was also additionally a little more complicated because it wasn't just our call. It was also Netflix in the conversation as well, and contracts were involved. So with that, when we had the timeline to set out, everything we had to do had to work off of that time as the hard constraint. And that's where resources and scope were kind of more the things we tuned to try to make the final product.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, this has been a nice journey through the innards of gaming production.
Yeah.
And I'd like to thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Louis, for having me.
Constraints the Podcast receives resource support from the Alan Slate Radio Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University and is co-produced by Louis Moroney and Mihir Kore. Please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts to automatically be notified when a new episode is posted. Also, follow us on Instagram at constraints_podcast. Constraints the Podcast is brought to you by Hi-Fi Handiwork. Sound advice.